South Carolina, 1877. The war had been over for a dozen years, but the land didn't seem to know. At the edge of Columbia, where the trees lean low and the soil still sweats memory, stood the Whitaker Plantation, 3 stories of white timber and ghostly pride. They said the house could breathe. That on summer nights, you could hear it sigh through its shutters, like it was remembering things it shouldn't. The townsfolk called it the Big House, but those who had lived and bled beneath its roof had another name for it, the house that never slept. Even the wind seemed to move differently here. It carried whispers, not words. The cotton fields stretched out like a cemetery dressed in white, every stalk a gravestone without a name. And under that stillness, the ground pulsed with something old. Inside, the halls were lined with portraits, pale faces staring down from gilt frames, eyes too alive for paint. Cornelius Whitaker's ancestors watched everything. They'd built their fortune on backs that bent and broke, and even now, their painted smiles refused to fade. The war had stripped the South of its chains, at least on paper. Men were free, women could walk without papers in their pockets, and the law had new words for old lies: Reconstruction, progress, equality. But none of that language reached the Whitaker estate. Here, time hadn't moved forward. It had only folded in on itself. At night, the servants whispered of a single window that stayed lit long after midnight, the one in the topmost room. Behind it lived Eleanor Whitaker, Cornelius's only daughter. The town was told she was ill. Nerves, her father said. A fragile mind. But the ones who worked the fields, who swept those halls, they knew better. They knew the sickness wasn't hers. It was his, passed down, disguised as love, hidden behind soft words and locked doors. The house had seen the war come and go, but its cruelty never needed muskets. It lived in whispers, in orders spoken too softly to sound like commands. And when night fell, it came alive again, in creaks, in breath, in the sound of one lonely woman pacing the same 12 steps between her bed and the window. They said if you stood in the yard long enough, you could see the lantern flicker. Always the same light, always the same room. And if you listened, really listened, you might hear something else. Not a scream, not a cry, something quieter, like the sound of truth waiting for someone brave enough to open the door. Because what haunted the Whitaker Plantation wasn't the dead. It was the living, and the secrets they'd buried alive. Cornelius Whitaker wasn't the kind of man who shouted. He didn't need to. His power lived in quiet places, in the pause before a command, in the way people looked down when he entered a room. He called it dignity. Others called it fear wearing a clean shirt. Each morning he woke before the sun, polished the same gold watch, and walked the veranda like a man inspecting the perimeter of his kingdom. The war had ended, yes, but Cornelius still ruled. Not with chains or whips, those were relics, but with reputation. With silver coins that carried stories no one dared to repeat. To the town, he was a gentleman, a survivor of hard times, a protector of his fragile daughter. But behind the carved oak doors of the Whitaker house, he was something else entirely, a man rotting from the inside, feeding on control the way others fed on faith. The servants still called him master, though the law no longer required it. Some out of habit, others because the word still felt safer than his name. Even Clara, the old housemaid who'd seen every sin in that house twice over, kept her eyes on the floor when he spoke. He liked it that way. He believed silence was a kind of respect. Cornelius kept records of everything, receipts, names, dates. He even catalogued his own guilt, like it might one day earn him absolution. But he never wrote about Eleanor. Her name appeared nowhere. No ledger, no diary, no letter. It was as if she existed only when he allowed her to. At supper, her chair stayed empty. He told guests she was delicate. He told the preacher she was touched by melancholy. But when no one was looking, he locked her door from the outside. Rumor had it he'd been paying men, colored men, to tend to her as he called it. A cruel arrangement disguised as therapy. They never stayed long, those men. The town saw them arrive, quiet and unsure, and saw them leave with faces that never faced anyone again. Cornelius told himself it was mercy, that the world was too rough for a woman so frail. But deep down, he knew. He wasn't protecting her. He was preserving her, like a possession too precious to let go and too broken to display. At night, he'd sit in his study beneath a portrait of his father, a man who'd once owned 200 souls and died believing God was on his side. Cornelius would pour himself a drink, stare at that portrait and whisper, "I've kept it all together." But the house knew better. The walls had heard too much. They could smell the fear behind his cologne, the rot under his prayers. Because every empire built on silence eventually cracks. And upstairs, behind a locked door, the first crack had already begun. The room at the top of the stairs was always colder than the rest of the house. Not by much, just enough to make the air feel heavy, as if it remembered too much. The wallpaper had faded from cream to yellow, peeling near the corners like it was trying to escape. The curtains stayed drawn except for a sliver of light that crept through at noon, slicing across the floorboards like a blade. That was Eleanor Whitaker's world. 12 paces long, 8 paces wide. Her kingdom of silence. To the townsfolk, she was the ghost in the window, a pale figure glimpsed between the drapes, never waving, never leaving. They said she'd gone mad, that her father kept her hidden for her own safety. But madness wasn't her illness. It was her inheritance. Eleanor hadn't spoken above a whisper in nearly 3 years. Words had become dangerous things in this house. Every one of them could be used against her. She had learned that lesson the night her mother died. No one ever told her how it happened. They called it a fall, but Eleanor remembered the bruises long before the fall and the scream that never quite made it to her ears. After that night, the house got quieter. Her father began to pray more often, and every Sunday, he made sure the preacher blessed the upstairs door. He said it was for protection, but it was really for concealment. Sometimes, Eleanor would press her ear to the wood and listen. Below, she could hear footsteps, Clara's slow shuffle, the clink of dishes, the occasional knock of Cornelius's cane against the floor. Each sound was a reminder of the world she no longer belonged to. She'd stopped counting the days a long time ago. The seasons came and went only through scent, the honeysuckle of summer, the dry dust of harvest, the damp chill of winter seeping through the cracks. Her father sent her meals through Clara, always laced with a strange powder that made her drowsy and compliant. "For your nerves," he said. She drank it once, woke up 2 days later, and never touched it again. Since then, she'd learned to fake it, sip, smile, swallow nothing. She wasn't sick. She was surviving. Quietly. Cleverly. At night, she sat by the window with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the moonlight spilling over the cotton fields. The white rose shimmered like ghosts in prayer. Sometimes, when the wind picked up, she could almost hear singing, low, mournful, and far away. The sound of people who used to be here and who, in some way, still were. Eleanor didn't believe in hauntings, but she did believe in memory. And memory, in this house, was the cruelest kind of ghost because it didn't vanish. It waited. One night soon, the lock would turn. And when it did, the house that never slept would finally wake up. Isaiah had learned a long time ago that silence could save a man's life. He'd carried it with him since the war. That stillness, that measured breath that said, "I see everything, but you won't see me." He came back to South Carolina the way most ghosts return, quietly, without fanfare. No uniform, no title, just a name and a purpose. The letter that brought him there had been written in the fine hand of Cornelius Whitaker himself. Light work, it said. Private duty. Pay in silver. Isaiah knew the tone, smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that smiled while it strangled. When he reached the estate, the air itself felt old. The cotton fields were overgrown, the fences sagged, and the big house gleamed too white, as if scrubbing away its sins could fool the sun. Clara met him at the side door, her back bent, her eyes sharp. She studied him a long moment before saying a word. "You the new one?" Isaiah nodded. You got quiet on you, she muttered, half to herself. Good.
Keep it.
You'll need it in here. He followed her through the hallways. Every board underfoot seemed to groan in warning. The smell of varnish and something sweeter, rotting fruit, maybe, hung in the air. He saw the portraits, the polished brass, the locked doors. And at the end of the corridor, a single staircase that spiraled upward into shadow. That's where she stays, Clara whispered.
Who?
Miss Eleanor.
Don't stare.
Don't speak unless she speaks first. Isaiah said nothing, but he felt the weight of the words sit heavy in his chest. That night, Cornelius greeted him in the study like an old acquaintance. You're a man of discipline, I hear, the master said, pouring 2 glasses of brandy. I respect that. He talked of progress, of how the South was rebuilding, how a man could make something of himself if he just learned where he belonged. Isaiah listened, eyes steady, face unreadable. He'd heard the sermon before, from men who believed the world was born for them and borrowed by everyone else. When Cornelius slid a small pouch of coins across the table, Isaiah didn't reach for it. He only asked, "What exactly is it you want me to do?" Cornelius smiled. "Help my daughter. She's done well. Needs calm company. Familiarity. You seem calm." There was a pause, long enough for the lie to show its teeth. Isaiah nodded once, slow. "I can keep quiet." "Good," Cornelius said. "The house appreciates discretion." As he left the study, Isaiah glanced up the staircase. The lantern was burning behind that topmost door, steady, golden, alive. And in that flicker of light, he saw something that made his breath catch. A shadow, small and still, standing by the window. The house might have belonged to Cornelius Whitaker, but Isaiah could already feel it. The quiet didn't belong to him anymore. It was shifting, listening, and it had just found its witness. The first time Isaiah climbed the stairs, the air changed. It thickened, not from dust, but from something heavier.
History. Pain.
The kind that sticks to the walls. Each step creaked like a warning.
12 of them.
By the time he reached the top, he could hear his own heart in the stillness. He paused at the door, tray in hand, a plate of food, a vial of powder, and a note from Cornelius. For the nerves. He knocked once. No answer. Knocked again, softer. The latch clicked. The door opened just enough for him to see her, a figure sitting at the edge of the bed, her back straight, her hands folded. Her hair was pale gold, her nightdress frayed at the sleeves. She looked up, but not at him, past him, through him, as if her eyes had long forgotten what people looked like. "Miss Eleanor," he said quietly. No response. He set the tray down on the table. The silver clinked too loud in the silence. Cornelius had told him she wouldn't speak, that she was fragile, frightened, best handled gently. But the woman before him didn't look fragile. She looked contained, like someone holding her breath so long she'd forgotten she was allowed to exhale. "I'm Isaiah," he said. "Here to help." The words felt strange in his mouth. They weren't true, not yet. He hadn't come to help her. He'd come to understand. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Time didn't work right in that room. Then, soft as dust falling, she spoke. "You don't have to." Isaiah froze. The words were barely there, just air shaped into sound. She finally looked at him. For the first time, their eyes met. And in that glance, something cracked open. Not fear. Not madness. Recognition. He saw it there, the same kind of quiet he carried inside himself. The kind born not of peace, but of survival. He took a step toward the window, looked out at the cotton fields glowing under moonlight. "It's a long way from quiet out there," he said softly. She didn't answer, just followed his gaze. Then he added, "I ain't here for him." She blinked, once, twice, like trying to remember how to believe someone. Then she nodded. The smallest, simplest nod in the world. Neither spoke again that night. He sat in the wooden chair by the wall. She stayed on the bed. 2 people breathing in the same space for the first time, not as master and servant, not as sickness and cure, but as witnesses to the same unspoken wound. When Isaiah left, the lantern still burned. But it didn't flicker anymore. It glowed steady. And down in the yard, for the first time in years, the wind changed direction. The house was still awake. But now, so was she. Morning crept into the room like a secret. For the first time in years, Eleanor didn't wake to fear, just confusion. The air felt lighter somehow, as if someone had opened a window in her chest. Isaiah had left before dawn, but his presence lingered, quiet as a promise. On the nightstand sat the small book he'd given her, a worn Psalms Bible, corners dog-eared, pages yellow with use. Inside the cover, in faded ink, someone had written, "They that sow in tears shall reap in joy." She traced the words with her finger. They trembled. Downstairs, Cornelius was already in his study, his silver watch ticking too loud for the hour. Clara brought him coffee, without speaking. She'd learned silence was safer than conversation. "He was with her a long time last night," she said finally. Cornelius didn't look up. And no crying, no noise, just quiet. "Good," Cornelius replied. "She needs stability, familiarity." But Clara knew that tone. Too calm, too practiced. She remembered the last woman he'd called unstable.
Mary.
Mary had been Eleanor's maid once. Young, warm, with hands that smelled of soap and sugar. She used to hum while brushing Eleanor's hair, songs older than either of them, songs born far from this land. When the nights grew too heavy, Mary would whisper, "Don't trust the house when it's quiet. That's when it listens." Then one night she was gone. Cornelius said she'd stolen silver and fled north. But Eleanor knew better. She'd seen the look in her father's eyes that evening, the same cold stillness he wore when he prayed. For years, Eleanor tried to bury the memory, but now, holding the worn bonnet she'd found beneath her floorboard, a bonnet that once belonged to Mary, the past refused to stay quiet. She unfolded a small note tucked inside the cloth. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "If I don't make it, tell her she was never alone." Her hands shook. She read it twice, then a third time, until the tears finally came. Not loud, not desperate, just steady, like something the house had been waiting to hear. When Isaiah returned that afternoon, Eleanor didn't turn away. She was sitting on the floor near the window, Mary's bonnet in her lap. He knelt beside her, eyes soft, waiting. "I remember her," Eleanor said. "She used to sing." Isaiah nodded. "My mama used to, too." Said songs were the only thing they couldn't chain. For a long time they said nothing. The wind outside rustled the shutters. A loose floorboard creaked beneath them, like the house was listening in. Finally, Eleanor whispered, "Do you think she's still here?" Isaiah looked around the dim room, at the walls that had swallowed so many voices. "Yeah," he said quietly, "but not like he thinks. She's not haunting this place. She's waiting for someone to remember her." Eleanor closed her eyes and pressed the bonnet to her chest. "I remember you, Mary," she said. And in that moment, for the first time in 20 years, the house exhaled. That night, the house didn't rest. The wind moved through the halls like a restless spirit, pushing against doors that had forgotten how to open. Downstairs, the grandfather clock skipped a beat, just once, as if time itself had stuttered. Isaiah couldn't sleep. He sat in the workers' quarters, sharpening his knife by lantern light. Each scrape of metal against stone echoed like a heartbeat. Not for defense, for remembrance. The blade had belonged to his brother Samuel, gone since the war. When dawn came, he carried the knife to the study. Cornelius was away inspecting the fields, his arrogance leaving the house unguarded. Isaiah knelt by the fireplace and drew a mark into the underside of the mantel, a circle, broken in two, with a single line cutting through the middle. A sign his old teacher Jacob had called the mark of returning, a wound that refuses to close. He whispered as he carved, "For Samuel, for Mary." The smell of scorched wood filled the room. Then silence again, thick, knowing. He wiped the soot from his hands, leaving faint prints along the wall. The house would remember. That afternoon, he found Eleanor sitting by the window, hair unbound, the bonnet folded neatly beside her. She looked up when he entered. not startled, just aware. "There's writing in this house," she said quietly. "I can feel it." Isaiah tilted his head. "Writing? In the floors, the walls, like they're trying to speak." He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small strip of burnt fabric, the same cloth he'd used in the study. Maybe they just need help finding their voice. Eleanor took the fabric, turned it over in her hands. It smelled faintly of ash and oil. "What is it?"
Memory, he said.
"The kind that don't stay buried." Something flickered in her eyes. Not quite fear, not quite hope. "I want to help," she said. So they began quietly. Every night after Cornelius retired, Isaiah left small marks around the house, behind doors, under tables, along the stair rail. Simple shapes. Circles.
Lines.
Echoes of something older than language. Eleanor would follow in the morning, tracing them with her fingertips. To anyone else, it looked like nothing. But to her, each mark hummed with a strange, living energy, as if the walls themselves were beginning to confess. Clara noticed first. "The air feels different," she whispered to Isaiah one morning as she scrubbed the kitchen floor. "Like the house is thinking." "Maybe it is," he said. By evening, Cornelius felt it too, though he didn't understand what it was. He sat in his study, eyes darting to the corners, uneasy. "Drafts," he muttered. "Just drafts." But upstairs, in Eleanor's room, the marks were beginning to glow faintly under moonlight, shadows bending around them like breath. And somewhere in the bones of the house, beneath wood, beneath guilt, something old had started to stir. By the next week, the Whitaker house no longer sounded the same. Its silence had changed color. It wasn't empty anymore, it was waiting. Eleanor noticed first. The air in her room had a pulse. When she walked across the floor, the boards seemed to breathe beneath her feet. She began moving differently. Not like a prisoner tracing the same 12 steps, but like a woman testing the boundaries of her cage. Each morning she opened the curtains just a little wider. Downstairs, Isaiah kept to his work. Fixing doors. Mending steps. Replacing floorboards that didn't need replacing. Each repair left another mark beneath the surface. Quiet as prayer, deliberate as scripture. To anyone else, he was just a laborer. But the house knew better. The house was learning his language. The other workers started to feel it too. Eli, an older man whose back carried decades of fields, stopped mid-stride one morning and stared at the porch. "You feel that," he said to Clara. She frowned. "Feel what?" "The stillness. Ain't the kind that keeps peace. It's the kind that comes before thunder."
And he was right.
That evening, Cornelius tried to lead grace at dinner. His voice trembled for the first time. The words of his prayer didn't fall right. They seemed to hang in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Clara caught him glancing toward the ceiling, as if he could sense movement above his head, a shift, a weight. Eleanor sat by her window, listening to the wind hum through the shutters. Then, faintly, she heard something else. Voices. Not clear enough to make out words, just murmurs. Familiar, rhythmic, low. She opened her window wider. The sound grew stronger. Workers in the fields, humming under their breath. A tune she hadn't heard since childhood, Mary's song. Her breath caught. For the first time in years, she began to hum with them. Soft, at first. Then louder. Louder until her voice found itself again. Below, Isaiah heard it, that single note floating down like a dare. He stopped stacking wood and looked up toward her window. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Clara, standing in the kitchen, began humming too. Eli joined in. Ruthie, the scullery girl, followed next. Within minutes, the sound filled the house, a chorus of low, steady humming that rose and fell like the tide. Cornelius froze in the study, his glass halfway to his lips. What in God's name? But even God, it seemed, had stepped outside to listen. The house vibrated with sound, a sound it had spent decades trying to silence. And in that vibration, paint cracked, floorboards shifted, dust drifted from the rafters like snow. For the first time in its long, cursed life, the Whitaker house wasn't whispering. It was listening. listening to the people it once owned, and to the one voice that had learned to rise above its walls. By dawn, the hum had stopped, but the house was no longer the same. Something inside it had shifted, not broken, just woken. Cornelius Whitaker felt it in his bones. He walked the halls like a man lost in his own kingdom, touching the banister, the walls, the portraits, as if afraid they might answer him back. And in a way, they already had. The marks Isaiah carved were everywhere now. He'd left them in plain sight. On the stair rail, on the doors, even on Cornelius's own desk, carved beneath the polished surface where only touch could find them. Cornelius traced one absent-mindedly with his fingertip and pulled back as though burned. The wood was warm. That afternoon, a murmur began to spread through the property, whispers of a gathering at dusk. No orders were given, yet everyone knew. The field hands, the kitchen girls, even the stable boys, all walked toward the old barn, slow and steady, as if drawn by gravity. Eleanor walked among them, bonnet tied at her wrist, Mary's note pressed to her palm. Isaiah walked beside her, silent, but with a presence that seemed to steady the earth beneath them. When they reached the barn, the doors stood open. The air inside was thick with dust, and smoke from lanterns hung along the rafters. A table had been dragged to the center, and on it lay the old ledger, Cornelius's book of names, purchases, and prices. Eleanor stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was soft but sharp enough to cut through generations. "I was never sick," she said. I was silenced. A ripple moved through the crowd. Heads lifted, backs straightened. Isaiah opened the ledger and began to read. Not the prices, but the names. Samuel,
Mary, Lena, Malachi,
Rachel. After each one, the people answered with a single word. Here. The sound grew low, rhythmic, unstoppable. Each name another resurrection. Each here another nail pulled from the coffin of their history. Cornelius appeared in the doorway, face pale, eyes wild. "Enough," he shouted. "You will stop this blasphemy at once." Eleanor turned to him. Her voice didn't waver. "This isn't blasphemy, Father. This is truth." He stepped forward, shaking. "You ungrateful child. I gave you everything." "No," she said. "You took everything, even the right to remember." For a long, terrible moment, the only sound was his breathing. Then Isaiah spoke. "The law forgot us, but memory didn't." Cornelius's voice cracked. "You think this changes anything?" Isaiah's eyes met his. "It already has." He reached into his coat and placed the knife handle Jacob had given him beside the ledger. "This belonged to the man who taught me how to mark what can't be spoken. Now you get to see it." Cornelius looked around the barn. The faces, the eyes, the fire in every breath. He tried to speak, but no words came. And for the first time in his life, Cornelius Whitaker stood in a room full of people who didn't fear him. They remembered him. That night, no one locked their doors. The house on the hill stood silent, stripped of its power. But for those gathered in the barn, silence no longer meant submission. It meant peace. The morning after the reckoning rose quiet, not the frightened quiet that had once filled the Whitaker estate, but a kind of peace that trembled on the edge of rebirth. The house stood still against the rising sun. The shutters hung open. The curtains fluttered like white flags. Inside, for the first time in decades, every door was unlocked. Eleanor walked barefoot through the hallways. Her steps left faint prints in the dust, marking paths that had been forbidden her entire life. When she passed her father's study, she didn't pause. The chair sat empty, the desk bare except for 3 coins and a single word carved into the wood, paid in full. She didn't ask who'd carved it. She didn't need to. Isaiah's work always spoke for itself. In her hand, she carried the ledger, the same book that once reduced people to property. Now it was something else, a record of survival, a map of memory. She laid it on the parlor table beside Mary's bonnet and Lena's copper earring. Sunlight spilled over the pages, touching every name like a blessing. Clara entered behind her, carrying candles. She placed one at each doorway, 12 in all, one for every soul the house had swallowed. When she finished, she looked at Eleanor and said, "Now they'll see light when they come home." Outside, Isaiah stood on the porch, the morning wind playing in his coat. He turned when Eleanor joined him. For a moment, neither spoke. Words weren't needed anymore. They'd already said everything that mattered. She looked toward the fields, once rows of grief, now shimmering gold in the early sun. "What happens now?" she asked. Isaiah smiled, faint but certain. "We remember. And then we build." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small mirror Cornelius had once used to stare down his own reflection. It was cracked now, spiderweb lines slicing through the glass. Isaiah placed it face down on the porch rail. "Some things don't need to see themselves again," he said. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of smoke, not from destruction, but from cleansing. Clara was burning the last of Cornelius's papers in the yard. Pages turned to ash, then to sky. Eleanor watched until the smoke thinned. "Do you think the house will ever sleep?" she asked. Isaiah looked back at the tall white frame behind them. "No," he said softly. "But it don't need to. It just needs to listen." As the sun climbed higher, the Whitaker Plantation no longer looked like a monument. It looked like what it had always been, a body finally at rest. That night, they gathered once more beneath the stars, Isaiah, Eleanor, Clara, Eli, Ruthie, and the others, not to mourn, but to speak names. Each name rose into the dark like a spark, a tiny rebellion against forgetting. And when the last name was spoken, the house sighed, one long, tired breath, and the wind carried the sound across the fields, across the years, across every place that ever thought silence could win. Because what the house couldn't kill wasn't flesh. It was memory. And memory, once spoken aloud, never dies.